In an effort to use some of the footage that we have stockpiled but haven't yet edited videos out of, here's one that is very nearly a year old. This is a pretty straightforward episode, and all we're doing is replacing the front left wheel bearing on our 1988 S10 Blazer. But before jumping into the work, we'll give this video a little bit of context. This was recorded a little under a month after buying the 91 Firebird, so it still needed a lot of work before we could drive it, and about a week before we finished reinstalling the rebuilt transmission and transfer case in the Silverado so that I could drive that. So I'd been switching back and forth between driving the 78 Firebird and the S10 Blazer, but then my girlfriend's car broke down. We won't be getting into that car in this video, although we have a lot of footage of it, so it'll probably be in some video eventually. But in the meantime, before her car was up and running again, I lent her the S10 Blazer. I didn't necessarily want her driving it because, well, it's a death trap, but she really liked the truck. Well, besides the fuel economy. But after I lent it to her, after maybe 200 miles, it started having a severe vibration in the floorboards of the truck. We replaced the wheel bearings before we ever drove the truck, so at this point they had just a little over 5,000 miles on them, and they really shouldn't be bad. I mean, it's not like they suffered any trauma or anything. I can't imagine what could have happened to make that wheel bearing fail so quickly. Yeah, it's really weird, just have no idea. Anyway, it was a very easy problem to diagnose, and even before I had the truck in my possession, I had already ordered the parts and was ready to install the new hub bearing. This has all been a long-winded explanation of why we're replacing this wheel bearing at around 11 PM on a weekday. There wasn't a lot of time to do it in, but we needed to do this quick repair before we could get it safely back on the road. Or at least as safely as it ever has been. We'll start by jacking up the truck and setting down the frame on jack stands. And with that secured, we'll give the wheel bearings a quick check to confirm that that is indeed the problem. The first test we can do is to grab the front and back of the tire and just wiggle the whole assembly back and forth as well as in and out. In this case, the loose steering of the truck makes it look a little bit worse than it is, but there is definitely some play there and a lot more than is acceptable. Before assuming that it's any one part, you'll definitely want to check that it's not a loose tie rod end or ball joint even, anything like that. In this case, that excessive looseness was definitely just in the hub. The second test we'll do is just spinning the tire and listening for noises. A bad wheel bearing won't always make noise unloaded and spinning slowly like this, but in this case it was audible. It's a little tough to hear above the din of all the local fauna, but if you listen closely there is a bit of a rumble there. Sometimes just the brake pads and the rotor can make a little bit of noise, so you'll also want to make sure that's not what you're hearing. You'll also want to take note of excessive rolling resistance in the bearing. In this case though, it wasn't really noticeable. So at this point, we can be pretty confident that the wheel bearing is the problem, and the right one does not exhibit any of these symptoms, so it's just the front left. This was also in line with the vibration that you would feel going down the road, because the passenger wouldn't feel very much in the floorboard, but on the driver's side, the vibration was very noticeable. So there you go, we have a confident diagnosis of the problem before even taking anything apart. At this point, it's also a good idea to double check the ball joints while you're here. In this case, putting a board or breaker bar underneath the tire and using that for leverage to lift it up and down can find issues there. You'll want to test this both with the suspension unloaded as well as with the jack under the lower control arm lifting up a little bit to load the suspension. Everything checked out here, so we'll go ahead and remove the lug nuts in preparation for removing the wheel bearing. And with the wheel out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the next thing that needs to come off, which is the brake caliper. This truck doesn't have a steering lock, or at least a working one anyway, so you can just grab the whole knuckle and rotate it by hand. And with a bit of stop motion magic, the slide pins are out and we can go fine. Okay, we use the impact gun. But no matter which method you use to remove the pins, the next step is to slide off the caliper, set aside the brake pads, and hang it up so that it's not hanging on the brake hose. A bungee cord or a piece of coat hanger or whatever you've got will do that job just fine, just make sure it's not pulling on the hose. Then, since we've taken all this stuff apart before, we can just slide off the brake rotor. When we first got the truck, getting these rotors off the first time is why we had to originally replace these wheel bearings. Unfortunately, there's no video footage of this, but we'll just say it took a lot of brute force. But with the rotor off, the next step is to remove the cotter pin that's holding the CV axle nut retainer in place. We straightened out the cotter pin legs as best we could, and then we were lucky and it came out easily. Then to remove the axle nut, we'll use a 36mm socket and the impact gun. This one had been removed relatively recently, so it wasn't stuck in place, but still these things are pretty tight. I've yet to find an axle nut that this impact gun couldn't loosen, but the other way to do this is just to set the vehicle on the ground and use a breaker bar. Although, of course, back in episode 1 of this series, we saw that that could sometimes be met with mixed successes. Anyway, this time, the nut came right off and then we removed the washer behind it. And again, since this had been taken apart and the splines had been greased, the CV axle is ready to come right out. The next step is to go to the inside of the steering knuckle and remove the 3 bolts that hold on the wheel hub. With the swivel adapter, the front and back bolts are impact gun or ratcheting wrench accessible, although the top one is a little bit tighter. The upper ball joint stud and the CV axle are in the way, so we'll just go ahead and use an old-fashioned open-end wrench. And approximately 600 years later we had the top bolt removed, and luckily we had saved the front bolt, so we had a little bit of catharsis in using the impact gun again. So now all the fasteners have been removed, and all we have to do is slide the hub off of the steering knuckle. Well, it's a little easier said than done, because even on this one that's less than 2 years old, it's already rusted in place. The pry bar and hammer combination wasn't doing much good, so we just started hammering on the wheel hub itself. We're replacing it anyway, so it doesn't matter if it ends up a little more damaged. The method we ended up using, which is the one I've had the most luck with for this sort of thing, is to thread back in the bolts a little bit less than tight and then give them an attitude adjustment. You'll want all the thread engagement you can get, so just leave a small gap under the head of the bolt. And especially if you have to reuse the bolts, don't get too aggressive with this method. It's more about moving to one side, giving it a few taps, moving to the other side, giving that a few taps, and kind of trying to wiggle the whole thing loose. When I got stuck trying to remove the rusty old wheel hubs on the Silverado a while back, we ended up using a similar method to this, where we jammed a crowbar against the bolt head behind the steering knuckle and rammed the steering wheel side to side until everything came loose. If you're really stuck and a little bit daring, you could even start the vehicle and use the power steering to help you do that. Just be aware that not all vehicles were built to support this method. I ended up trying the same thing on the wheel hub on an import car, and all it wanted to do was bend the control arm in half. In that case, heat, penetrating fluid, patience, or in place of patience, an air hammer, are all your friends. But here, we were able to hammer on the bolts front and back to make a gap and then use the pry bar to wiggle it the rest of the way out. I honestly don't remember how hard the fight was to get these out the first time, but I imagine that I used a similar method. And with that finally loose, we can slide the hub and dust shield out of the way. And now we can put our 2 hubs side by side and make sure that they match up. They appear functionally identical and everything's the same size, so I think we're in good shape. For vehicles that use this type of hub assembly, you simply replace the whole thing instead of pressing out a wheel bearing and just replacing that. With the new and old one side by side, we can also compare the noise and play that each one exhibits. In the old one, you can definitely hear a bit of a rough grinding noise even just turning it by hand. While the new one is pretty much silent and doesn't make much noise at all. The new one also has basically no play, at least as far as I can feel. While the old one, yeah, it's definitely not the best. That said, it's not yet catastrophic either, so it's definitely good to get ahead of these things when a problem arises. Now, this new hub came with something that the last ones I bought didn't, which is the inner seal. I think this is usually called a slinger seal, and it seals the CV axle to the steering knuckle. A lot of vehicles don't even use seals like this, and as mentioned, the previous hubs I had installed didn't even come with them. From memory, I think it did have some sort of seal here when I got the vehicle, but they were so destroyed I just popped them out and didn't reinstall anything. And that certainly could be part of the reason that the hub had rusted in there so quickly and was difficult to remove. So at least this time we have a seal to help keep water out of there, and this little O-ring that I suppose seals the hub to the knuckle. We took some time with sandpaper, a wire brush, and a Scotch-Brite pad to clean out as much of the rust as possible inside of the knuckle and ensure that the new hub will slide in easily. We'll also clean up the sealing surface a bit on the CV axle, especially since it hadn't been sealed in quite some time. Then we'll apply some wheel bearing grease to that sealing surface to help keep everything lubricated. We'll apply a not insignificant amount of anti-seize to the steering knuckle in an effort to help keep the hub from rusting in again. Then we'll get that seal in place and grease the splines of the CV axle. It ended up being a little tricky to get that seal into place, but this piece from a ball joint press kit got the job done. Then we put a touch more anti-seize on our 3 hub bolts and reinstalled them. And we'll use those to locate and hold in place the brake dust shield. Then we can take our new hub, with the O-ring installed onto the back of it, and slide it over the CV axle. We'll move everything around till we get the splines to line up, and then we can start threading in the 3 bolts. We'll tighten the bolts a little bit at a time, moving from corner to corner to help pull the hub into the steering knuckle straight. And pretty soon, we had all 3 bolts pretty tight and there was no visible gap between the hub, the dust shield, and the steering knuckle. Then we'll grab the torque wrench and tighten the bolts down to 86 foot-pounds. Since we couldn't quite get the torque wrench on the top bolt, we'll use 2 wrenches hooked together to get it nice and tight. Then we'll give everything one final check to make sure things are looking good. And we'll apply a little bit of anti-seize to the hub surface and the threads on the CV axle. We'll reuse the old washer, but the hub came with a new CV axle nut, so we'll use that. It's generally advisable to use new axle nuts whenever possible, especially on vehicles that don't use cotter pins. But in this case, the new axle nut just didn't work. The threads appeared to be the same, but when we tried to tighten it down, it wasn't just a lock nut thing, it was, I don't know, something just was not lining up correctly. So instead of just trying to ramrod that thing all the way onto the CV axle and very likely damaging something, we'll just reuse the old nut. This one is probably factory and isn't a lock nut or anything, so it just slides right on. We'll tighten it up a little bit for now, but we'll torque it before we're done. Then we'll apply a light coat of anti-seize to the surface of the hub before installing the rotor. Definitions of light coat might vary, but in this case it's definitely a good idea not to use too much. And with the rotor in place, we'll do the same thing to the outside surface of it where the wheel will sit. We'll take our brake caliper off of the hook and reassemble it by sliding back in the brake pads. It doesn't want to slide into place, so we'll very slightly tighten a lug nut onto the rotor to keep it still. Then, once we have everything back in place, we'll grease and reinstall our slide pins. And those will get torqued down to 37 foot-pounds. So that's all in place, but we still need to torque down that axle nut. For certain vehicle and wheel combinations, this means you have to get a bit creative. Here we're showing what happens if you just try to block the rotation of the hub with a board. The suspension is compressing and we're actually starting to lift the whole vehicle off of the jack stands before the torque spec has been reached. In this case, that spec is 174 foot-pounds. So instead of doing all of that, all we have to do is reinstall the wheel, install the lug nuts and tighten them down a bit, and set the vehicle on the ground with the parking brake firmly engaged. These wheels don't have any kind of center cap, so it's easy to put the torque wrench on them and tighten them down. And there you go, the axle nut is torqued to spec. We'll briefly lift the blazer up again and roll the wheel to make sure everything seems okay. It does spin a bit more easily than before, and all of the grumbling, growly noise is gone. We'll reinstall the axle nut retainer and a new cotter pin to hold everything in place. I'm personally a big fan of these extra long cotter pins, although they're a little bit silly and way longer than they have to be. Everything seems ship-shape, so we'll set the truck back on the ground and torque down all of the lug nuts. On most vehicles, you'd have a dust cap which covers up the axle nut. But as far as I can tell, these never came with dust caps, and I haven't been able to find any in the aftermarket. I guess they figured just covering them up with the original hubcaps would have been enough. So we have everything back as it was with our newly replaced wheel bearing. And a quick test drive on and off the highway confirmed that the vibration is totally gone. But, as usual, this repair took way longer than it should have, and it was now 1 in the morning. But we managed to get it done in the window we had, and the truck was once again ready to hit the road.